Gog and Magog, two names buried in the Bible that have sparked centuries of debate. Are they nations? Are they symbols? Or could they be a warning for our future? Let's dig in. Some say Gog and Magog are Russia, others point to the Middle East. Some believe they're purely spiritual, not political at all. What about you? When you hear those names, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? Tell me down below. I'd love to see where you stand before we unpack this together. The names first appear in the Old Testament, in the book of Ezekiel, chapters 38 and 39. Ezekiel describes a powerful leader named Gog from the land of Magog who gathers a massive coalition of nations to attack Israel in the last days. The prophecy is dramatic. Ezekiel says armies will come from the north like a storm, covering the land like a dark cloud. Their goal is to destroy, to plunder, and to wipe out God's people. Imagine the tension, an unstoppable army bearing down on a small nation. But the story doesn't end with Israel crushed. Instead, God himself steps in. He shakes the earth, he sends fire, hail, and panic, and the invaders are destroyed. What do you think about that? Do you see it as a literal battle that still hasn't happened yet, or more like a spiritual picture of how God always defends his people? Fast forward to the last book of the Bible, Revelation chapter 20. The names Gog and Magog appear again, but this time in a slightly different way. After the 1,000-year reign of Christ, Satan is released for a short time. He deceives the nations of the earth and gathers them together for battle. And once again, the names Gog and Magog are used to describe this massive rebellion. John says their number is like the sand of the sea. They surround the camp of God's people, but fire falls from heaven and devours them. The story ends not with fear, but with God's final, unstoppable victory. Now, here's a question for you. Why do you think John borrowed those same names from Ezekiel? Do you think it's describing the exact same event, or do you see them as two different battles with a similar meaning? Let me know what you think, because people have debated that for centuries. Ezekiel gives details about nations: Persia, Cush, Put, Gomer, and more. These names covered regions from what we now call Iran to parts of Africa to areas in Europe and Asia. It's a worldwide coalition. Some people look at today's map and try to line these names up with modern countries. Others say we shouldn't even try, that it's more about the spirit of rebellion than about specific borders. Where do you stand on that? Do you see this as a prophecy pointing to exact modern nations, or as a timeless symbol of the world rising against God? One of the most striking parts of Ezekiel's vision is how God describes his role. Gog thinks he is in control, leading this invasion by his own power. But God says he is the one who puts hooks in his jaws and brings him out. In other words, even when evil looks like it's winning, God is still in charge of the story. That raises an interesting question. Why would God allow such a massive enemy to rise up at all? What do you think? Is it to test his people, to reveal his power, or to give the world one last chance to see who he really is? The battle Ezekiel describes is intense. Earthquakes split the land, mountains fall, fire and hail pour down. The invaders panic and turn on each other. The destruction is so massive that it takes 7 months to bury the bodies and 7 years to burn the leftover weapons. It's a terrifying picture, but it's meant to leave no doubt. God wins. Evil does not stand a chance. And yet, Revelation expands this picture. John doesn't name Persia or Cush. He doesn't list individual nations. Instead, he uses Gog and Magog as a kind of shorthand, a symbol for all the enemies of God, all the nations deceived by Satan into rebellion. It's less about geography and more about a worldwide uprising. Here's where I'd love your input. When you read Revelation, do you take it literally, like a future war with real armies? Or do you see it symbolically, showing us that in the end, evil will unite against God, only to be crushed? Every generation has looked at the world and wondered, is this it? Is this Gog and Magog? In the Middle Ages, people thought it might be the Mongols. Later, others pointed to the Ottoman Empire. In the Cold War era, many said it was Russia. Today, some still point to Russia, some to China, some to alliances in the Middle East. What about you? When you look at world events right now, do you see signs that remind you of Ezekiel and Revelation, Or do you think it's still far in the future? But here's the deeper truth. Gog and Magog aren't just about nations. They represent something spiritual. The human heart, apart from God, always rebels. Gog is the picture of pride, of self-rule, of thinking we don't need the Creator. In that sense, Gog isn't only out there, he's also in here. Have you ever felt that pull in yourself, that resistance to God's way, that desire to go your own direction? How do you fight that in your life? I'd love to hear your honest take in the comments. That's why the message of Gog and Magog is not only about fear or destruction, but about hope, because in both Ezekiel and Revelation, it's God who fights the battle. Israel didn't win by its own strength. The church doesn't survive by its own power. It's God who steps in, God who saves, God who finishes the fight. That's something we need to remember in our personal lives, too. When you're overwhelmed, when it feels like the enemy is too big, do you try to fight it all yourself, or do you let God step in? And let's think about this. Revelation says Satan is released for a short time at the end, and then he deceives the nations again. Why do you think God allows that? Wouldn't it be easier to just end it all without another rebellion? Some people say it's because God wants to reveal the true nature of evil before destroying it forever. Others say it shows that even in a perfect world, human pride will still rise unless it's surrendered to God. What do you think? Why allow evil one last moment before the final victory? Now, here's where it all connects to Jesus. On the cross, he already defeated the ultimate Gog and Magog, sin and death. Satan thought he had won, but God turned the tables. The resurrection was the ultimate sign that rebellion cannot win. That's why John could write Revelation with such confidence. He wasn't predicting an uncertain future. He was announcing a guaranteed outcome. Do you agree with that the victory is already won, even if the battles aren't finished yet? Or do you feel like the fight still looks too overwhelming when you look at the world today? Imagine standing on a battlefield, outnumbered, terrified. Gog's armies surround you, weapons shining, voices shouting, and then the sky cracks open. God himself steps in. The earth trembles, fire falls, and in an instant the enemy is gone. Can you picture that? That's the hope woven through these prophecies. Not that evil is strong, but that God is stronger. So here's the challenge for all of us. When we read about Gog and Magog, do we get caught up in trying to match names to nations? Or do we let it remind us that God will always have the last word? Which matters more to you, figuring out the timeline or trusting the outcome? The story of Gog and Magog ends in the same way every time, with God victorious and his people safe. And that's what we can cling to when the news feels overwhelming, when wars and disasters shake the world. Do you see Gog and Magog rising in our time, or do you think this is still far in the future? Tell me what you think. I know people will have different perspectives, and I want to hear yours. Because at the end of the day, Gog and Magog are not the headline. God is. The point is not that rebellion is strong, but that it always falls before his power. And one day we'll see the final victory, when there's no more war, no more enemy, no more deception, only peace, only joy, only God dwelling with his people forever.